First Person is produced in cooperation with the Far East Broadcasting Company, who rejoice in the stories of changed lives through the power of Jesus Christ. Learn more at FEBC.org.
Reading so much about Hannah when I wrote the book on Wilberforce, I thought I'd really love to see her take center stage, and I think the gift of finding so many gems among her writings, I hope that those will sort of find new life and meaning for readers of the book.
Lessons learned from a woman who lived long ago on this edition of First Person. Welcome, I'm Wayne Shepherd, and we're about to be introduced to an 18th century woman who, while not well known today, had a great impact for the gospel in her day. Stay with us as we talk with biographer Kevin Belmonte. Each week, First Person focuses on a life that brings honor to God. Most of the time, it's a testimony from present-day believers, but once in a while we reach into the past to see what we can learn. To scan a list of past interviews, please visit firstpersoninterview.com. You can choose to listen to any one of them there online. firstpersoninterview.com. You can also find us on social media at facebook.com/firstpersoninterview. Kevin Belmonte has been with us previously as he's written a number of interesting biographies, including William Wilberforce and D.L. Moody. Now his biography of Hannah More is being released this next week, and Kevin joins me in conversation about this saint from the past. And for many people, the leading question is, who was Hannah More?
Well, I think for a lot of people, those who might know the film Amazing Grace from 2007, she has a cameo in there. So she was a great friend of Wilberforce, but she was far more than that. She was a philanthropist, a famous poet and playwright in her own right when she met Wilberforce. So she was already well known and pretty much a household word in the England of her time and throughout the English-speaking world. She was something of a celebrity, a public intellectual, a gifted artist, if you will. But certainly when she and Wilberforce met, they found common ground in their abolitionist endeavors, but also in educational reform. And we can maybe unpack that a little bit later. But on both of those counts, abolition and educational reform, on those things alone, she deserves to be remembered because she did some remarkable things.
Yeah. Well, she was so many things. I mean, in the literary world, her name was a household name in the 18th century, right?
Absolutely. She was part of a circle of very gifted women called the Blue Stocking Circle. There were some men as well. It was sort of a literary salon, which was popular. They would get together and discuss literature and that sort of thing, or read from their works. Not too terribly different from the Inklings, Lewis and Tolkien, to come closer to our own time. But she was a published poet. She worked with Samuel Johnson, the great British man of letters. She had her portrait painted by a sister of Sir Joshua Reynolds. Her plays were quoted from at length in all the leading magazines of the day. Matter of fact, one of her poems, called The Bas Bleu, which was sort of about this literary circle that she was a part of, became so popular that King George III asked for a copy of it, and she sat up one night and wrote the whole thing out for him so he could have an autographed copy.
Interesting. She grew up in a family with several sisters, but she never married, did she?
No, and that's both a point of curiosity but also a source of heartbreak. As someone who was gifted and published as a playwright so young, she won the attraction of many who were wondering where her career would go, and of course her conversation was captivating. People who knew her describe her as a vibrant and very attractive personality, so it's not surprising she caught the eye of a gentleman named Turner, and they got to know one another through chaperoned events on his estate, and before too long he proposed to her and she accepted. There's every indication that there was a real sense of love there. It wasn't just a sense of meeting someone who was well off and wanting to be well settled in life. They really had a lot of things in common, but here's where the tragedy comes in. For whatever reasons, and it's not entirely clear since we don't really have his side of the conversation too much, he kept putting off the wedding to the point where she may well have been left at the altar, if not once, then maybe twice. And this went on for a number of years, and it was a humiliating thing where tongues began to wag and wondering what was going on, and finally, discreetly and thoughtfully, tactfully, through the aid of a clergyman, she was able to break off the engagement. But that was a source of deep pain to her. And for someone who had known so much success early in life, that was definitely a cloud that to darken her horizon.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk more in depth about her educator role and many aspects of her life, but what makes her of interest to Christians, particularly in our day?
Well, I think one of the ways that we can find a way in, as it were, to her life and times is through the written word. When I began to read her writings, Wayne, I thought, this is a beautiful mind, a great gift of intellect, very learned in all the schools of learning, both ancient wisdom and modern learning of the time. She spoke several languages. But when she put pen to paper, many times I would come across a passage that just sort of stopped me in my tracks because it was deeply eloquent on the one hand, but also very wise and insightful. And she could cast a phrase that just lingered in the memory, and it reminded me a great deal, I thought straight away, of the way C.S. Lewis could cast a phrase, and it just registers with you, and it's something you return to because each time you read it, you find there's something more to discover, and she had that quality. So I've often thought a great service could be done by putting together sort of a Hannah More reader and picking the real gems from her writings, which run into the thousands of pages altogether, some 19 volumes I think her published works run to. But a real service could be done in allowing people to experience something of her voice and what it was like to spend time with her through a book like that, I've often thought.
Yeah. Well, of course, much later, C.S. Lewis did pay particular attention to Hannah More, didn't he?
That's right. He read the memoirs that were published a few years after her death and really had a great deal of appreciation for her literary style as reflected in the letters that were quoted. And I used one of the things that Lewis wrote about her in reading that particular work and saying it casts a lot of interesting light on her life and times and that wonderful atmosphere of people who were gifted in all the spheres of endeavor, whether it was the arts or politics or culture or literature, whatever sphere of endeavor was going on, she seems to have known everybody. So I think Lewis was captivated for that reason. But I think the most compelling thing that I read from him about her was a tribute to her and her fellow evangelicals who worked for so long to abolish the British slave trade. And he was saying, you know, we have this phrase, you're so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. And Lewis turned that on his head. He said, you know, it's the people whose minds were most occupied with heaven who worked and for so long, so faithfully, who were able to achieve such great good on earth through abolishing the slave trade. And it was a lovely tribute to that part of their legacy.
Well, I noticed on page 145 of the book that you quote something she wrote that I really, with your permission, Kevin, I'd like to read this because I think it really reveals Hannah More's attitude toward the Scriptures. This is what she said: Christianity is not to be examined, nor the sacred Scriptures perused, as if they were merely to be believed and remembered and held in speculative reverence. But let it rather be impressed that the Holy Scriptures are God's great means of producing that awe of His presence, that reverence of His majesty, that delight in His infinite perfections, that practical, affectionate knowledge of the only true God and of Jesus Christ whom He has sent, which constitutes the rest, the peace, the strength, the light, the consolation of every soul which attains to it. If I knew nothing else about Hannah More, that would be enough right there, Kevin.
Oh, I think you have it right there. Reading that passage, and it's so fine to hear it read expressively like that. It's kind of like hearing an audiobook before we have an audiobook. But no, it's lovely to hear her words be alive again as you've read them. But the takeaway for me in hearing that passage, she had a sense of reverence for the Scriptures that I think we would do well to be mindful of and sort of carry it over into our own lives. When you read a passage like that, you get the sense she was aware every day that in reading the Scriptures we have a chance to enter the courts of our heavenly King and have an audience with Him. And so they're not just words on the page. There's something majestic and regal and profoundly meaningful anytime we take up the Scriptures and ask the Lord to speak to us through them. And I think that air of reverence and worship and adoration just pervades so many passages in her writings.
Yeah. I think two of her writings that you talk about in the book are I think they're books, right? Practical Piety and Christian Morals. Were those both books of hers?
They were, and they were written pretty late in her career as a writer in the early 1800s, circa 1815, 1811. That's the time frame for both of those books. And she wrote them, it has to be said, when she was often not feeling well. She was an invalid for many periods of her life, and she often experienced chronic pain. And so you read the preface to two of these works, which I think are two of her finest works, with some of her most wise and eloquent reflections. They were written amid a time of suffering, and I think that helps to put a human face on her life and legacy. When we realize that some of these books that we take up and read, or can take up and read, with deep appreciation, they weren't something that was easily done. Sometimes they were won at great cost, and when I read that preface, my heart really went out to her, because you got the sense that in some places she might have had to dictate because she just couldn't sit up long enough to really do some of the writing and research herself. So that, I think, sort of underscores how special these books were, but a lot of people who read her writings and are students of that time come back to those two particular works as being very representative of the gift the Lord gave her in a literary way.
There's more about the life of Hannah More, and Kevin Belmonte will tell us about it coming up on First Person. Here's Ed Cannon on the vision for FEBC's weekly podcast.
The primary purpose of Until All Have Heard, of course, is to share the experience that FEBC has because we have staff on the ground in so many oppressive places. But in addition to that, we're trying to speak to you in a way that only the kind of testimonies you'll hear from around the globe can do.
Discover how the gospel is making a difference around the world. Search for Until All Have Heard on your favorite podcast platform, or hear it online at febc.org. My guest is Kevin Belmonte, whose latest biography is called The Sacred Flame. Kevin has been with us before talking about William Wilberforce, or talking about D.L. Moody, and others we've talked about as well, Kevin. I always really enjoy the lessons we learn from your research and your writings on these folks. And Kevin joins us from his home in Maine, where there's no internet service at the moment. I know you have it typically, but today we're on the telephone, Kevin, so that's okay too.
Right. A little bit of old school tech, but it's working just fine. And I'm so grateful, Wayne, that you thought to mention Wilberforce, because it's not known now, but during the time that Wilberforce and Hannah More were alive and working together on philanthropic projects, their friendship, their partnership for good, the making of a better world, was famous in its own right. To the point where Americans who had taken trips to England for their health or for reasons of wanting to visit the old country, as it were, if they made a pilgrimage to two places, very often it was to see Wilberforce and or Hannah More, or both. And their friendship was written about in all kinds of periodicals in America and in the UK that made their way across the pond to America. And so, you think of famous collaborations now in charitable good works. You see them on the TV and that sort of thing. That sort of dynamic was going on with Wilberforce and Hannah More. Their famous friendship and their philanthropic endeavors were written about many times.
Yeah, I smiled when I read the account that you tell in the book of Wilberforce meeting her for the first time. Here's what he said. He said, "I went in 1786 to see Hannah More, and when I came into the room, Charles Wesley rose from the table, around which a numerous party sat at tea, and coming forwards to me, gave me solemnly his blessing. I was scarcely ever more affected." So there's a moment in history when Wilberforce meets Charles Wesley. You have an account of what Hannah More said about Wilberforce. She said, "I find here a great many friends, but those with whom I have chiefly passed my time are Mr. Wilberforce's family. That young gentleman's character is one of the most extraordinary I ever knew for talents, virtue, and piety. It is difficult not to grow wiser and better every time one converses with him." What a great thing to say about someone.
It is, and what it points to for me is the recognition that when Wilberforce, who had only just come through what he called his great change, 1785 over into early 1786, for that meeting with Wesley, through the good auspices of Hannah More to have taken place. Wilberforce is a very young believer, and Hannah More is coming alongside him to encourage him in the things of faith. And what a thing for her to do to facilitate a meeting between him and Charles Wesley. That in itself was a great kindness. But I think she had a gift for spotting people who just had such potential for good. That had happened in her own life. People noticed her. She was from humble means, but they noticed her gifts. People came alongside her, like John Newton, who was one of Wilberforce's friends. And I think you have this small circle of remarkable circumstances where the Lord, in providential ways, was bringing together these groups of very gifted people. And to use Wilberforce's phrase, they would form what they called concerts of benevolence. And so, you think about Charles Wesley, Hannah More, and Wilberforce being in the same room with all the streams of good that flowed from their lives. And it's a powerful moment because it actually took place, but I think it's also powerful symbolically.
Yeah. And, of course, the issue of slavery was one that they worked tirelessly on together, but also, just in general, just help for the poor was something they both had a heart for.
Just 3 years after Wilberforce met Charles Wesley at Hannah More's home, Wilberforce came to visit. I've been to the house where he stayed. It's called Cowslip Green, and it's in Somerset. And there are these famous cliffs, the Cheddar Cliffs, and we think of cheddar cheese. It's that region of England.
Yeah.
But these famous cliffs that people would take a basket of wine and cold chicken and go for a hike for the day. And Wilberforce loved to walk, so they recommended he do that. He set off, and he was gone the whole day, came back that evening, and the Moore sisters, Hannah and her sisters, noticed that the basket had been untouched. The wine was unopened, and Wilberforce seemed to be preoccupied, and they asked him what was in his mind, and he said, I just can't get the picture of all these people, these farmers, these miners, people who are close to the land, working such hard lives and in such poverty, and there are no schools for them. And he went to his heart, and he said, Hannah More, something must be done for cheddar. And he said, if you will be at the time, I will be at the expense. And through something as seemingly understated as that, became a movement that they both spearheaded that ended up educating thousands of children over the years in at least 9 schools in and throughout that region that Hannah More and her sisters created and trained people to facilitate. So it's a remarkable thing. This concern for the poor, it's rather like us today going into an inner city or seeing some place where there's great need and just saying, we've got to do something about this. That, I think, that kind of scene, that kind of setting helps that time become more real for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're glossing over so many of the details of her extraordinary life, but they are, of course, in Kevin's book, The Sacred Flame, talking about Hannah More. I do want to take a couple of minutes because I found it so interesting that, of course, her lifetime was during the conflict between the American colonies and Britain, the American War for Independence, and she generally sided with the English. But her friend Edmund Burke is known as someone who sided with the colonists, and it made for an interesting relationship.
His victory as member of Parliament, I believe it was for Bristol, which was the city that she lived near, was due in no small part to the political support that he received from Hannah and her sisters. She wrote letters round on his behalf to commend him to voters, and she was sort of something like an ad hoc campaign manager or a point person. So they got to be friends prior to the American War, or the War of Independence as we would call it, and they were very fond of each other. Of course, she and her sisters had read his books. His book on the origin of the sublime and beautiful, which was sort of a philosophical literary treatise that touched on a bit of the arts. And they knew that book very well, and when they met him, they wrote letters about how thrilled they were to meet him. But when the war happened, Burke, who was sympathetic to the American cause, and Hannah More had something of a falling out. And it's a shame that happened, but there was a rapprochement in their lives that concerned another revolution where they both came down squarely on the same side of the issue, which was the revolution in France, which gave way to the terrible reign of terror under Robespierre and people being beheaded, and that that very violent time where revolution, the fear was that would cross the channel and there would be sort of an overthrowing of the king in England. It was a very fraught time. England was at war. They were able to come together again, and Burke, to his credit, had deep appreciation for the things that Hannah More wrote decrying the violence and the excesses and the threat of invasion from revolutionary France. So they found a way to find common cause again, but sometimes these conflicts that we read about in the history books, sometimes these conflicts endangered friendships, and sometimes other friendships were severed, but this one, thankfully, was repaired.
Yeah, great lessons again for us today. In the couple of minutes we have left, I believe your longest chapter in the book has to do with her latter years. Talk about that part of her life.
Well, that is something to which I'm indebted to an author that we both admire, David McCullough. And I remember so well in reading his book about Harry Truman and hearing him speak about it. He said in some ways the last years of Harry Truman's life were by far the most interesting. Instead of sort of being a winding down of the story, as it were, where interactions with famous people and events seemed to sort of be few and far between. In Hannah More's life, quite the reverse was true, as it was true for Truman. And delving into that time of her life, when Americans by the score and people from the UK and other places in Europe were constantly making a pilgrimage to visit Hannah More, this famous woman who had known so many famous people in her youth and had done so many noteworthy things, they wanted to meet her, to the point where she was holding an open house at her home for as many as 3 times a week. She would provide food for these people and put on receptions for them. She actually sort of became sort of an ambassador of good works, is the only way I could think to describe it. But they would write these long accounts of what it was like to meet her, to talk to her, how she had these amazing dark eyes that sparkled when she spoke, how full of wit she was, as well as stories of good things that had been accomplished and fought hard to secure. People remembered visits to her home, and her home in later years was called Barleywood. They remembered that all their lives, and there's a huge debt of influence philanthropically to America, where these Americans would sort of catch the bug for wanting to foster the good society from their meeting with her, go back home, and there were places like the Hannah More Academy in Maryland that were started, or schools for the deaf that were funded partly from her, but stories that she encouraged these people working with the deaf. So even in old age, she found a way and delighted in being someone who could help be an encourager and a supporter of things that she might not be able to do actively herself, but she could kind of empower others to go and pursue these good things.
I'm grateful for these lessons from great Christians of the past. My thanks to Kevin Belmonte for introducing us to Hannah More on this week's First Person. Now, Kevin's book is titled The Sacred Flame, a biography of Hannah More, and we'll have a link to this new book at firstpersoninterview.com. There's also informative links there to Kevin and the other books and biographies he's written. We're also on social media at facebook.com/firstpersoninterview. These interviews are provided in part by the Far East Broadcasting Company. FEBC is committed to living out the gospel in our day, just as Hannah More was in her day. There are many exciting stories of how God is using radio programs and online ministry produced by FEBC around the world. You can read and watch many of them at febc.org. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Thank you for listening to First Person.